She threw his toolbox across the garage floor like it was trash. Tools scattered everywhere. The entire crew went silent, 30 pairs of eyes watching. "Get this man out of my building," Victoria Sterling said, her voice ice cold. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody said a word. And Mason Ryder, the man who had built the very company she now owned, picked up his scattered tools one by one off the concrete floor without saying a single word back. He already knew something none of them did. That race car behind her, it was going to kill someone today. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications because this story is going to shake you. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you want more stories like this one, smash that like button. Now, let's go back to where this all began. The garage smelled the way it always did: motor oil, burned rubber, and something metallic underneath everything else that Mason Ryder had never been able to name. He'd worked in places like this for most of his adult life. The smell had soaked into his clothes, into his skin, into the kind of muscle memory that never really leaves a man no matter how far he walks away from it. He was 45 minutes early, same as every morning. Most of the crew wouldn't show for another hour. The overhead fluorescents in Bay 7 were still flickering, had been flickering for 3 weeks now. And Mason had already put in 2 separate work orders about it. Both had been ignored. He grabbed a folding stool from the corner, positioned it underneath the light fixture, and got to work on it himself. That was the job. Not the official job, technically. His official job title was Facility Maintenance Technician, Grade 2, which was the kind of title that existed specifically to make a man feel replaceable. But Mason had always been the sort of person who fixed things when they needed fixing, regardless of whether the paperwork authorized him to. He had the light stabilized by the time crew chief Danny Ortega walked in, coffee in one hand, hard hat in the other, looking like a man who hadn't slept since Tuesday. "You're here early," Danny said. Light was still out. Danny looked up at the now steady fluorescent. "I put in a work order for that 2 weeks ago." "I know, I put in another one last week." Danny made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "And yet here you are, fixing it yourself." Somebody had to. That was the rhythm of it. Mason showed up early. Mason fixed things nobody else bothered to fix. Mason went home. That was his life now, and he had made a deliberate choice to be okay with that. It wasn't where he'd imagined himself at 32, but a lot of things weren't where he'd imagined them. He climbed down from the stool and folded it back against the wall. Through the wide bay doors, he could see the new car, the one they were testing today. Titan Velocity's latest prototype, the TV9. It had been rolled out into the main garage overnight, sitting under the bright track lighting like something that wanted to be looked at, which it did. That was the point of these machines. They were built to command attention. Mason looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked away and went to get his morning checklist. Quote, the name Titan Velocity Motors meant something in racing. It had always meant something. The company had started in a converted warehouse in suburban Ohio 30 years ago, built from nothing by the Sterling family. Old money that had decided it wanted to make something instead of just inherit something, which was at least more interesting than most old money managed. Over 3 decades, Titan Velocity had grown into one of the most respected racing engineering firms in the country. 3 national championships, 2 prototype land speed records, a dozen drivers whose careers had been built on the machines that came out of these garages. Mason knew this history the way you know the bones of your own hand. He also knew that the TV9 sitting in Bay 1 had a problem. He'd noticed it 2 days ago, not because he'd been asked to look at it, because nobody asked the maintenance technician to look at prototype race cars. He'd noticed it because he'd been cleaning the drain channels near the rear suspension housing, and a specific angle of the garage lighting had caught the subframe in a way that made something look wrong. A hairline, maybe, or a stress mark that had no business being where it was. He hadn't said anything yet. He'd needed to look closer first, and finding a reason to get close to the TV9 without looking like he was out of his lane required some navigation. He found his opening that morning when one of the junior mechanics, kid named Travis, barely 22, still in the phase where he knocked things over and apologized to them, rolled a diagnostic cart directly into the rear quarter panel of the car and left a smear of grease along the lower chassis rail. "Hey," Mason said, walking over with a cloth. Let me get that before it sets. Travis looked mortified. I barely touched it, I swear. It's fine, just give me a minute. He crouched down beside the rear of the car. He wiped the grease away slowly, methodically, the way a man wipes something when he needs an excuse to keep his eyes in one place. And there it was. Not a hairline. Worse than a hairline. The subframe weld at the left rear lateral mount showed a fracture. Not surface level, not cosmetic, but structural. A crack that ran maybe 3 centimeters along the base of the weld joint, in a location where torsional load during cornering would concentrate enormous stress. At racing speed on a track surface, under test conditions, that weld would not hold. Mason stayed crouched there for a moment longer than he should have. He stood up slowly. Travis had moved on, oblivious. Around him, the garage was filling up. Engineers arriving with tablets and laptops, mechanics running morning prep checks, logistics people moving through with clipboards. The TV9 was scheduled for a full performance test at the private track out back. 3 hours from now. Driver already confirmed. Mason went to find Danny Ortega. The left rear lateral mount, Mason said. The weld's cracked. You can see it if you get down and look at it from the right angle. Danny was staring at him with an expression that hovered somewhere between concern and skepticism. You're sure? I'm sure. Mason, that car went through a full structural inspection last week. 4 engineers signed off on it. I know, and I'm telling you the weld is cracked. Danny rubbed the back of his neck. He looked across the garage at the TV9, then back at Mason. He was a man caught between 2 things he trusted: the official process that had already cleared the car, and the instinct of a maintenance worker who, in Danny's experience, had been right about every mechanical problem he'd ever flagged, however small. I'll take a look, Danny said. They walked over together. Danny crouched down where Mason directed him. He looked for a long moment. He stood back up. I see something, Danny said carefully. I'm not sure I'd call it a crack. What would you call it? I'd call it something that needs a second opinion from the engineering team. Then let's get them. The engineering team is in a pre-test briefing right now, Mason, with Ms. Sterling. That was the first time Mason heard the name spoken aloud in the building. He'd seen it on the memo that had circulated 3 weeks ago. Effective immediately, Victoria Sterling assumes operational ownership of Titan Velocity Motors. But he hadn't paid it much attention. Sterling family, new generation taking over. It happened at companies. It wasn't his concern. Then interrupt the briefing, Mason said. Danny looked at him. Danny, that car cannot go on the track today. He should have stopped there. In the version of this story where Mason Ryder makes the sensible decision, he lets Danny handle it, goes back to his checklist, and waits to see what happens. That would have been the smart play. That would have kept him invisible, which was the way he preferred things. But Mason was watching them roll the TV9 toward the testing bay doors, and the driver, a kid named Ramirez, couldn't have been older than 25, was already pulling on his race suit across the garage. And so Mason did what he'd always done in rooms where the wrong decision was about to be made. He went and said something about it. He crossed the garage floor with his toolbox and positioned himself near the front of the car, close enough to the rolling path that the crew pushing it would have to stop. Hold on, he said. Hold on, this car needs to be looked at. The crew stopped. They looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something at the wrong time. Not angry yet, just confused. Who are you? One of the engineers said. Maintenance, but I'm telling you there's a structural fracture in the left rear lateral mount. That weld will not hold under test conditions. A door opened across the garage. Several people came through it. The engineering team, post-briefing, already in mid-conversation. And behind them, a woman Mason hadn't seen before. Tall, early 30s. Dark blazer, dark hair pulled back, moving through the room with the particular kind of confidence that doesn't ask permission from anyone. Victoria Sterling stopped when she saw her car blocked by a maintenance worker with a toolbox. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, it just sharpened. What's going on here? She asked. One of the engineers turned. This is, he's from the maintenance crew. He's saying there's a flaw in the car. Victoria looked at Mason directly. And what are your qualifications for making that assessment? The garage had gotten quieter. People were noticing. I can show you exactly where the fracture is, Mason said. It's at the left rear lateral mount, base of the weld joint. 3 centimeters, roughly. It's not visible from standing height, but if you come down here... The car was inspected last week, Victoria said, by 4 credentialed engineers. I understand that, and I'm telling you what I found this morning. Something crossed her face. Not anger exactly, not yet. More like the kind of impatience that comes from a specific belief. The belief that some people are simply out of their depth and don't know it. I appreciate the concern, she said, and her tone made clear she did not. But we are on a schedule. This car has been cleared. Please step away from the vehicle. Ma'am, Mason said, and he wasn't raising his voice, wasn't performing anything, just standing there being steady. I need you to look at the weld before you put that driver in this car. The room went completely silent. Victoria Sterling looked at him for a long moment. In the years that followed, Mason would sometimes think about what she was seeing. A man in gray work clothes, worn boots, a toolbox, no credentials visible, no title attached to his name in any paperwork she would have seen. And he'd understand, even if he'd never excuse it, exactly how she got to where she went next. Get this man out of my building, she said. A couple of the security staff started moving. Victoria. That was Danny Ortega's voice from across the garage. Maybe we should... I said get him out. Mason didn't move right away. He looked past Victoria at the TV9, at the driver across the garage still pulling on his gear, at the 4 engineers who were all looking carefully at their shoes. Then he looked back at her. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. That was when she did it. She walked past him to his toolbox. A worn, steel-latched Craftsman case he'd owned for 11 years, picked it up by the handle, and threw it. Not at him. Past him. Across the floor of the garage. It hit the concrete and the latch burst open and his tools went everywhere. Wrenches and screwdrivers and calibration gauges and a small ratchet set that had been his late wife's birthday gift to him, all of it scattering across 20 feet of oil-stained floor. The noise it made was enormous. Security, Victoria said. Now. Mason crouched down. He started picking up his tools. Around him, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 30-something people standing in a ring of silence while a man in gray work clothes quietly collected his wrenches off the floor. Travis, the kid who'd knocked the cart into the car, made a small move toward him like he was going to help, and then stopped himself. Mason didn't look up at anyone. He found the ratchet set near the floor drain. The small brass clasp on its case was bent. He straightened it with his thumb as best he could and put it in his shirt pocket. He put everything else back in the toolbox in the order it belonged. He closed the latch, which no longer sat quite flush. He stood up. He looked at Danny Ortega, who was looking at him with an expression Mason didn't have a word for. Then he looked, one last time, at the TV9. Walk me through the security exit or don't, Mason said to nobody in particular. I know the way. He walked out of Bay 1, through the side corridor, past the parts storage and the locker room, and out through the employee exit into the parking lot. He put his toolbox in the back of his truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a minute with his hands on the wheel. Then he took out his phone and called his daughter's school to make sure he'd be able to get her at pickup. She's in art class right now, the receptionist said. Do you want me to pass along a message? No, Mason said. No message. She's fine. I just wanted to check. He started the truck. He hadn't gone 3 blocks when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He stopped at a red light and looked at it. They ran the test. The car failed at the rear suspension at turn 4. Ramirez is okay. Walked away. But the car is destroyed. D.O. Mason read it twice. He set the phone down on the passenger seat. The light turned green. He drove. When he got home, the house was quiet the way houses get in the middle of a weekday when nobody's supposed to be there. He set his toolbox by the back door out of habit. He went to the kitchen and put water on the stove for coffee and stood at the counter while it heated, looking out the window at the backyard. There was a swing set out there that he'd built in a single weekend 2 summers ago. It had taken him 14 hours across 2 days, working from plans he'd found online, Using lumber he'd selected himself and hardware he'd triple-checked before buying because he was that kind of person about these things. His daughter, Lily, had tried it out that Sunday evening while he stood below with his hands hovering a foot away from her, ready for any possibility. She'd pumped her legs and gone as high as she could and screamed with her eyes closed. That was a good memory. He kept it deliberately close. He poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen table and did not think about the TV9 or Victoria Sterling or the sound his toolbox made when it hit the floor or the 30 people who had stood there watching. He had made himself very good at not thinking about certain things. What he let himself think about was the weld. Because even now, even sitting in his kitchen with his coffee, fired, finished at Titan velocity, he was running through it in his mind. The fracture angle, the load path, whether it had been a manufacturing defect or a design flaw, and what that implied about the other cars in the fleet, whether the engineers who'd done last week's inspection had known or simply missed it. He already suspected it was neither. He suspected it was something else entirely. Something that didn't show up in a standard inspection because it wasn't supposed to be there at all. Because it had been changed. Made worse deliberately, or at least made worse carelessly, by someone who had been altering things they weren't authorized to alter and hiding it under paperwork that said otherwise. He'd seen the signs before. He'd spent years learning to see exactly those signs. That was a different problem for a different day. Today's problem was simple and immediate. He had a daughter who got out of school at 3:15, and he needed to have dinner started before then because she'd been asking all week for the pasta she liked, the one he'd learned to make from an old recipe card with his wife's handwriting on it, and that took an hour and a half if you wanted to do it right. He finished his coffee. He put the mug in the sink. He went to the pantry and started taking out what he needed. Okay. Lily Ryder came through the door at 3:22, backpack half off her shoulder, sneaker unlaced on the left foot, holding a drawing she'd made in art class that she announced was either a horse or a very fast car. She hadn't decided yet. "It's got 4 legs," Mason said. "Race cars have 4 wheels. That's basically the same." "That is not basically the same." "Dad." She dropped her backpack and climbed up on the kitchen counter stool and put her elbows on the counter and looked at the pot on the stove. "Is that the pasta?" "It's the pasta." "Did you put the thing in it?" "What thing?" "The thing. The thing Mom used to put in it. The thing that makes it taste right." He turned to look at her. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's eyes and the specific no-nonsense expression her mother used to make when she thought someone was being deliberately unclear. "The bay leaves," he said. "Yes, the bay leaves." "Yes, I put the bay leaves in." She seemed satisfied. She slid off the stool and went to go do homework, which she would do for exactly 8 minutes before finding a reason to come back to the kitchen and talk to him instead. He already knew this. He didn't mind. He stood at the stove and stirred the pot slowly, and outside the window the afternoon light was coming in flat and long across the backyard, catching the chains of the swing set and making them shine. It was a Tuesday in October, and the world was going on the way the world goes on. Completely, relentlessly, without adjustment for the size of what any single person has lost or survived or quietly carried. Mason Ryder stirred the pasta. He was, despite everything, still here. And there were things nobody knew about him yet. The car was destroyed. Not totaled in the ordinary sense. Not crumpled the way a street vehicle gets crumpled when something goes wrong. Racing machines fail differently. They come apart at speed, which means they come apart with violence. And what was left of the TV9 after turn 4 was a collection of carbon fiber panels and bent aluminum tubing spread across 40 meters of private track, still smoking in the October afternoon. Ramirez had walked away. That part was true. But walking away in racing means something different than it sounds. It means your legs still work, which is the minimum, not the standard. He'd hit the barrier at the left hip, and the force had sent him rotating into the gravel trap, and the medic who pulled off his helmet said the driver's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't have unbuckled his own harness. He'd be okay, eventually. Victoria Sterling stood at the edge of the track and looked at what remained of her car. The October light was flat and cold. She had her arms crossed, not for warmth, but in the particular way people cross their arms when they're trying to hold themselves together from the outside. Her lead engineer, a man named Patterson, was standing 2 feet to her left trying to say something useful. The rear suspension failed at lateral mount, left side. The weld. I know where it failed, she said. Patterson stopped talking. Around them, the track crew was moving through the wreckage in the careful, systematic way they'd been trained to, documenting, photographing, collecting pieces in numbered bags. Standard post-incident protocol. Victoria watched them and didn't move. She was thinking about the maintenance worker, the man with the toolbox, the one who had stood in her garage that morning with no credentials and no authority and told her, with complete quietness, exactly where this car was going to fail. She hadn't asked his name. That was the first thing she realized, standing at the edge of the track. In the middle of everything, the schedule pressure and the crew watching and the particular irritation of having her authority questioned by someone she'd categorized on sight, she had never once asked who he was. She turned to Patterson. The maintenance worker who flagged the car this morning, what's his name? Patterson blinked. I don't know exactly. He's facility maintenance, grade 2, I think. You'd have to check with HR. Then go check with HR. Patterson left. Victoria turned back to the track. The wreckage was still smoking at the far end. One of the carbon fiber side panels had come to rest against the barrier wall at an angle, and in the flat afternoon light it looked almost deliberate, like something placed rather than thrown. She stood there for a long time. His personnel file said, Mason Ryder, Facility Maintenance Technician, Grade 2. Start date, 11 weeks ago. Prior employment, listed as general contractor work, various. That was everything. One paragraph. Victoria read it twice, sitting at her desk at 7:30 that evening, the rest of the building long emptied out. The file was thin in the way files get thin when someone fills out the minimum required fields, and nothing more. No references checked, apparently. No background detail. Hired through a third-party staffing agency that Titan Velocity used for lower-tier facility positions, which meant the company's own HR had never directly vetted him. She put the file down and sat back in her chair. Something was wrong with this picture, and she couldn't quite locate where the wrongness was coming from. A maintenance worker who could identify a structural weld fracture in a prototype racing car, not just identify it, but predict with precision what would happen and where and at what point in the test, and whose entire employment record fit in 4 sentences. She pulled up the staffing agency's contact information and sent an email marked urgent. Then she did something she rarely did after 8 o'clock on a weekday. She went down to the archive. The Titan Velocity archive was in the basement of the original building, the oldest structure on the campus, built in the 90s when the company was still finding its shape. Most people in the current organization didn't even know the archive existed. Digital records had made it obsolete for day-to-day purposes, but the physical archive still held the original engineering documentation from the company's first 3 decades. Blueprints, prototype schematics, test records, design revision logs. The kind of institutional memory that never made it into the digital system because it predated the digital system by years. Victoria had been down here exactly once before, when she'd first taken over the company, doing what she thought of as an orientation tour of her own inheritance. She hadn't spent much time. There'd been too much else demanding attention. She found the light switch and stood in the entrance of the room. Metal shelving units ran floor to ceiling along both walls, holding hundreds of document boxes labeled by year and project code. The floor was concrete and the room smelled like old paper and something chemical. Blueprint paper, probably, the kind that used to be used before everything went digital. She pulled the boxes for the years the company had been at its peak. The mid to late period before her father had stepped back and the operational leadership had changed hands. The years that had produced Titan Velocity's 3 national championships and the prototype records that still stood. She spread the documents across a folding table near the light and started going through them. The first thing she noticed was the handwriting. Across dozens of original design sheets, on margin notes, on revision markings, on the small technical notations that engineers make when they're working through a problem in real time, there was a single consistent hand, not typed, not stamped, but handwritten in the way that tells you something about a person. Controlled, precise, the letters slightly compressed like someone who was always running out of space and had learned to write small to fit more in. She found the signature on the fourth sheet she looked at. M. Ryder, lead design, revision 3. She set that sheet down. She picked up the next one. M. Ryder, chief engineer, approved. And the next. Mason Ryder, final sign-off. She went through the box slowly after that. Not quickly, not with the efficiency she usually applied to things. Slowly, the way you read something when you need to be sure of what you're seeing. The name was everywhere. On the suspension geometry that had defined the company's championship-era cars. On the aerodynamic platform that 2 different records had been built around. On the structural framework that every subsequent Titan Velocity prototype had used as its foundation, including the TV9. Including the weld specifications for the lateral mounting system that the TV9 had deviated from, apparently, in ways that had contributed to today's failure. Mason Ryder had not been a maintenance worker who happened to know about race cars. Mason Ryder had designed these race cars. Victoria sat down on the folding chair near the table and put both hands flat on the document in front of her. Outside the single small window near the ceiling, the parking lot lights were orange and distant. The building was completely silent. She thought about the toolbox hitting the floor. She thought about the sound it made. She thought about the way he'd crouched down and picked everything up without looking at anyone. The way he'd walked out. She sat in the archive room for a long time after that. She called Patterson at 9:15. "I need you to pull every engineering record for the TV9 development program," she said. "Original specifications, revision history, every change order that was processed. I need them on my desk by morning." Victoria, that's a significant amount of documentation." "I know what it is. I need it by morning." There was a pause. "Can I ask what you're looking for?" "I'll know it when I find it," she said, and hung up. She drove home that night the long way, without meaning to. Just missed a turn and kept going rather than turning around, which was unlike her. Victoria Sterling did not miss turns. She planned routes and followed them. That was simply how she operated. Tonight she drove the long way and didn't particularly mind. The question that sat with her was not complicated, but it was uncomfortable in the specific way that questions are uncomfortable when the answer reflects badly on you. If Mason Ryder had been Titan Velocity's chief engineer, if his designs had literally built the company her family owned, then what was he doing pushing a maintenance cart through Bay 7? What had happened between the man who had signed off on championship-era blueprints and the man who had shown up 11 weeks ago through a staffing agency with a 4-sentence file? And why, when he had walked into that garage and tried to stop her from destroying one of his own machines, had nobody known who he was? She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car with the engine off. She was 30 years old. She had an MBA from Wharton and a decade of watching her father run this company before she'd taken it over. She had been, she believed, a thoughtful and thorough owner, whatever else you could say about her style. She had read the materials, done the analysis, made herself conversant in the technical language of racing engineering before she'd ever set foot in the garage. But she had walked into that building with certain assumptions already loaded, about who knew things and who didn't, about what expertise looked like and where it lived. And those assumptions had been so deep she hadn't even recognized them as assumptions. She just acted on them, the way you act on things you've never thought to question. She got out of the car and went inside. She did not sleep particularly well. But the staffing agency called back the next morning at 7:48. Victoria was already at her desk. "Mason Ryder," the woman on the phone said, in the slightly careful tone of someone reading from a screen. "He came to us directly. Requested facility work specifically. Our placement officer noted that he was, quote, overqualified for the role, but he was clear that it was what he was looking for." Did he give a reason? Personal circumstances. That's what the file says. And his background verification? It was minimal. For facility maintenance positions, we run a basic criminal background check and an employment verification. Mr. Ryder's check came back clear, and the prior employment he listed verified. What prior employment did he list? General contracting, various clients, self-employed, essentially, for the past several years. Victoria wrote that down. Before that? A longer pause, more clicking. He listed a gap period, about 5 years. Before that, he listed a position with, He listed it as engineering consulting. No company name provided, just independent consulting. And your placement officer didn't ask for more detail. It wasn't quite a question. The woman on the phone heard that. For the role he was placed in, she said carefully, the documentation was sufficient to our standard process. Victoria thanked her and ended the call. She sat with that for a moment. Overqualified for the role. The placement officer had noted it, had apparently shrugged at it. People took jobs beneath their skill level all the time, for all sorts of reasons. You didn't typically interrogate that when you were filling a maintenance position. She pulled up the engineering records Patterson had delivered, 4 binders worth, stacked on the left side of her desk. She opened the first one and started from the beginning. It took her most of the morning to find what she was looking for, and when she found it, she wasn't entirely sure she understood what she was seeing. Not at first. The TV9's original design specification listed the left rear lateral mount as a dual-weld structural joint with a minimum throat dimension of 12 millimeters, engineered to handle torsional loads up to a specific threshold that the vehicle would encounter under race conditions. This was in the founding documentation, the spec that Mason Ryder's signature, had he still been with the company, would have approved. The manufacturing record, filed 18 months later, showed the joint built to a single-weld configuration with a throat dimension of 9 millimeters. Not a dramatic change, if you weren't looking for it. The kind of change that could be explained in several ways. Material substitution, manufacturing constraint, engineer's field judgment during build. There was a change order in the file authorizing it. The change order had been signed by the current senior executive in charge of engineering development, Damian Cross. Victoria went back through the record. She found 3 other similar deviations in the TV9 build documentation. Each one small. Each one with a change order. Each one signed by Damian Cross. Each one moving the specification away from the original design in ways that reduced material cost or manufacturing complexity, and each one doing so in structural areas where the original specification had been set deliberately high. She knew enough engineering to understand what she was seeing. She did not know enough to understand why or how or whether it was intentional, but she knew who would. Danny Ortega picked up on the 3rd ring. "I need Mason Ryder's contact information," Victoria said. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to mean something. "Can I ask why?" "Because I need to speak with him." "Victoria, you fired him yesterday, in front of—" "It wasn't a small thing." "I know what I did," she said. "I need his contact information." Another pause. "I have his cell number from the crew contact sheet. I don't know if he'll pick up." "Give me the number." He gave her the number. She thanked him, which was not something she did with sufficient frequency, and she knew it. She dialed Mason Ryder's phone. It rang 4 times. Then, "Yeah." Not hello, just yeah. The way a man answers when he doesn't recognize the number and has decided to treat it with maximum neutrality. "This is Victoria Sterling," she said. A pause. Shorter than she'd expected, actually. "I know who you are." "Mr. Ryder." She had prepared for this call in the way she prepared for things. Thought through what she wanted to say, how to open it, where to take it. All of that evaporated immediately upon hearing his voice, which was level and completely unsurprised, and she found herself saying something she had not planned to say first. "The car failed at turn 4, at the left rear lateral mount, exactly where you said." "I know, he said. "Danny texted me. Ramirez is okay." "I know that too." She pressed forward. "I've been in the company archive. I've been looking at engineering records going back to the founding period." She stopped there, waiting to see what he'd do with that. What he did was nothing, for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Your name is on the original design documentation for every significant engineering achievement this company has produced. The championship platforms, the prototype records, the structural framework that the TV9 was built from." She paused. "And then your name disappears completely, about 5 years ago." The silence on the line was different now, heavier somehow. "Mr. Ryder, will you come in?" "No," he said, simply, without elaboration. She had expected that. "Can I come to you?" That one he didn't answer immediately. She could hear, faintly, something in the background of wherever he was. Dishes, maybe? Running water. My daughter gets home at 3:15, he said finally. I can be wherever you are by noon. Another pause. There's a diner on Calloway Street, Henderson's. I'll be there at 12:30. He hung up before she could say anything else. Victoria set her phone down on the desk and sat still for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer, took out a legal pad, and started writing down everything she needed to ask him, 3 pages worth front and back, in her precise, compressed handwriting. She capped her pen. She looked at the 3 pages. She put the legal pad back in the drawer. Some conversations you couldn't prepare for with a list. You just had to show up and let them be what they were. Datum. Henderson's Diner on Calloway was the kind of place that had been there so long it had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. Laminate countertops, vinyl booth seats, coffee served in ceramic mugs that didn't match. The kind of place where regulars got their coffee before they ordered it, because the staff already knew. Mason was in the back booth when she arrived. He had coffee in front of him and was not looking at his phone or reading anything, just sitting. His hands were around the mug and he was looking at the window beside him, which looked out onto the parking lot, which was not particularly interesting. He was wearing a gray flannel shirt and jeans, and he looked like a man who had slept adequately and eaten breakfast and was prepared to handle whatever the day brought him, which was different from looking like a man who was happy about it. Victoria slid into the booth across from him. A waitress appeared within 30 seconds and poured coffee without asking, which told Victoria this was in fact a regular's place for Mason, which meant this was his neighborhood, which meant she was on his ground. She was aware of that. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "You said you'd been in the archive," he said, bypassing the pleasantries with a directness that would have registered as rude in almost any other context, but somehow didn't here. "What did you find?" She had not planned to lead with an apology. She had planned to ask questions first, get the full picture, and then address what had happened in the garage from a position of full information. That was the logical sequence. Instead, she said, "I found out who you are, and I want to tell you that what I did yesterday was wrong." Mason looked at her. "I don't mean wrong in the sense that the car failed and you were right about it," she said. "I mean I treated you badly, publicly, in a way that She stopped, started again. "There's no version of that where the way I handled it was acceptable. And I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. The diner moved around them. A couple of other booths occupied, the counter with 2 men eating, the sound of the kitchen in the background. "What do you want to know?" he said. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't rejection. It was a man deciding to have a conversation about the things that mattered and table the things that didn't, for now. Victoria recognized that for what it was and respected it. "Why were you working as a maintenance technician?" He drank his coffee, set the mug down. "After my wife died, I left the company. I wasn't in a state to be running anything. I needed time. And then time turned into more time, and more time turned into 5 years, and at some point being invisible started to feel necessary in a way I didn't entirely examine. But you came back to Titan Velocity specifically. My wife liked the work I did there," he said. "She used to say it was the only time she could tell I was completely in my own element. I think I wanted to be near it again without it being what it used to be." He paused. "That probably sounds strange." "It doesn't," Victoria said, and she meant it. "I noticed the structural problems in the current fleet about 4 weeks after I started," he continued. "Not just the TV9. There's a pattern across multiple cars in the current program where the build specs deviate from the original design parameters in specific ways. I was still trying to figure out how to handle that when the TV9 test got scheduled." Victoria set her coffee mug down very carefully. "A pattern." "Yes." "In multiple cars." "Yes." She looked at him across the table. The morning light through the diner window was the flat gray of an overcast October day, and it made everything look a little more serious than it might otherwise. "Then I need you to show me." He looked at his coffee for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she could see him deciding something, not about her exactly, but about what he was willing to put himself back into. "My daughter," he said, "doesn't know what I used to do. She knows I fix things. That's how she knows me." "Okay. I'm not looking for recognition or title or anything like that. That's not what this is about. What is it about? He was quiet for just a second. There are drivers running cars right now that have the same problems the TV9 had, and some of those problems are worse. He looked at her steadily. That's what it's about. Victoria held his gaze. Outside the diner window, a car pulled through the parking lot and left again. The waitress refilled someone's coffee at the counter. Then let's fix it, Victoria said. It was the simplest thing she could have said, and it was exactly the right thing. She could tell by the way something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not relief, not warmth, but the specific settling that happens in a person when they realize they're not going to have to fight alone. They sat in Henderson's diner for another 2 hours after that. Victoria asked questions, and Mason answered them. And Mason asked questions about the current documentation, and Victoria answered those. And by the time the lunch crowd had thinned out, and the waitress had refilled their mugs 3 times each, they had the rough shape of something that needed to happen. Mason paid for his own coffee. Victoria noticed, but didn't make anything of it. Outside in the parking lot, before they went to their separate cars, Victoria said, I want to be clear about something. Whatever I find when I pull the full audit, whatever the source of these deviations turns out to be, your name is going back on the work you did. Every blueprint, every record. That's not conditional on anything. Mason was quiet for a moment. He had his keys in his hand and he was looking at a point somewhere past her shoulder, at the street beyond the parking lot. One thing at a time, he said. He got in his truck and drove away. Victoria stood in the parking lot for a moment before she went to her car. The October air was cold enough to see her breath. She hadn't noticed that inside the diner. She had come here thinking she was coming to understand what had happened in her garage yesterday. She was leaving with the understanding that yesterday was not actually the problem. Yesterday was just the moment when the problem had finally become visible. The real problem had been building for years. Underneath the surface of her company's records, in the spaces between what the document said and what had actually been built, something had been done deliberately and hidden carefully, and the person responsible had been doing it long enough to get very good at keeping it quiet. She started her car. She sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The pattern Mason had described, deviations from original specifications across multiple vehicles in structural areas, that was not the result of manufacturing error or engineering oversight. That was the result of choices made consistently over time by someone with access to the design records and the authority to approve change orders. And she already knew whose name was on those change orders. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward the company, and she did not take the long way this time. Damien Cross had an office on the 3rd floor with a view of the test track. It was a good office, not the best in the building, that was Victoria's, but good enough to communicate something about where he stood in the hierarchy. He'd been at Titan Velocity for 11 years, longer than most of the current engineering staff, long enough that his presence in the building had started to feel like part of the architecture. He knew where everything was. He knew how the internal systems worked, which vendors to call for which problems, which engineers responded well to pressure, and which ones needed to be handled differently. He was, by most functional measures, indispensable. He also knew, by Wednesday morning, that something had shifted in the building. It wasn't anything he could point to directly. Victoria had called a documentation audit. That was official, circulated through the appropriate channels, framed as a standard post-incident review following the TV9 failure. Routine. The kind of thing that happened after a car went into a barrier. Damien had processed that without alarm. He'd been involved in post-incident reviews before. He knew how they worked and he knew, more specifically, where their limits were. What bothered him was smaller than that. It was the way Victoria's assistant had requested specific binders from the archive. Not the TV9 files, which would have been expected, but older files. The original platform documentation from the championship years. And it was the way Patterson had been pulled into a closed-door meeting that morning and come out of it looking like a man who'd been asked questions he hadn't known the answers to. Damien Cross was a careful man. He had been careful for 11 years. He had developed, over that time, a particular sensitivity to the difference between routine institutional activity and the kind of activity that meant someone was looking at something they weren't supposed to be looking at yet. He went back to his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk and thought about what needed to happen before an audit reached certain parts of the record, and how much time he had to make that happen. He had been very careful, but careful had limits, and 11 years was a long time to keep something contained, and the TV9 had failed at exactly the point he'd quietly known it might. He pulled up his computer and started working. Mason came to the Titan Velocity campus on Wednesday afternoon. He had not been asked to come back as an employee. The conversation hadn't happened yet, was somewhere in a future neither of them had mapped out clearly. He came as something without an official category, which was fine with him. Categories had never been the part of the work he cared about. Victoria met him at the side entrance, the one that didn't run through the main lobby. That had been his idea, relayed through Danny Ortega, and she hadn't questioned it. He still wasn't ready to be a spectacle, and the main lobby on a Wednesday afternoon was exactly that kind of risk. They went directly to the engineering records room, which was on the second floor and smelled like printer toner and old coffee. Patterson was already there, sitting at a long table covered in binders and printouts, looking like a man who had not had a good 24 hours. Patterson looked up when Mason walked in. His expression shifted through several things quickly: recognition, confusion, and then something more complicated. "You're Mason Ryder," Patterson said. Not a question. He'd clearly been briefed. "Yeah," Mason said. "I've been looking at your original specifications for the past 6 hours." Patterson glanced down at the table. "I want to say that the aerodynamic platform work alone it's genuinely extraordinary. I studied that design in grad school without knowing who had made it." Mason pulled out a chair and sat down. "What did they tell you it was?" Patterson hesitated. The official company history attributed the championship-era engineering to the senior design team, collectively, no individual name. "Right." Mason's voice was even. He pulled the nearest binder toward him and opened it. "Show me the TV9 change order file." Victoria sat at the end of the table and watched the two of them work. This was not her language. She could read engineering documentation at a functional level, enough to understand the architecture of an argument, but the specific technical conversation that began between Mason and Patterson in the next 20 minutes was something she largely followed without contributing to. She was okay with that. She knew what she was good at, and she knew what she wasn't, and right now what the room needed was these two men and the documents in front of them. Mason went through the change orders slowly. He didn't narrate much. He'd make a sound occasionally, not quite a word, just an acknowledgement, and pull a specific page out to set aside. Patterson tracked with him, and every few minutes one of them would say something technical to the other that the other would respond to with a number or a reference to a different binder. After about 40 minutes, Mason sat back. "Okay," he said. Victoria looked at him. "What are we dealing with?" He picked up one of the pages he'd set aside and held it so she could see it. "This is the original specification for the TV9 rear suspension architecture. This number here," he pointed, "is the minimum material specification for the lateral mount weld, 12mm throat, dual pass, specific rod grade." He set it down and picked up another sheet. "This is the change order that was processed 18 months into the build. It modifies the weld spec to 9mm, single pass, different rod grade." He looked at her. "The change order cites a supply chain constraint as the reason." "Was there a supply chain constraint?" "I don't know. But here's the thing." He reached across the table and pulled 3 more pages from the pile Patterson had flagged. "These are change orders for the TV7, the TV6, and the prototype endurance car they were running last season. All 3 show similar deviations from the original structural specs. All 3 cite different reasons. One says material substitution. One says engineering field judgment. One says weight optimization." Victoria looked at the pages. "Different reasons. Same outcome." "Same pattern," Mason said. "Every one of these deviations reduces cost or complexity in the build process. Every one of them does it in a structural area. Every one of them is signed by the same person." He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. Victoria said it. "Damian Cross." "How long has he been processing change orders independently?" Mason asked. "He has signing authority up to a certain cost threshold," Victoria said. "It was established before I took over. My father gave him that authority." She paused. "About 6 years ago." Mason looked at her. "A year after I left." The room was quiet for a moment. He would have needed someone to generate the original designs, Patterson said carefully, after you were gone. Someone to produce new work that could be put forward as the company's ongoing development. He had the archive, Mason said. All my original documentation was here. He had access to the entire design library and the company's institutional memory of how those designs were produced. It's not simple to reverse engineer methodology, but if you're patient about it and you're willing to take shortcuts nobody's looking for. He stopped. How many cars in the current active fleet were built under his direct oversight? Patterson turned to his laptop. He typed for a moment. 7. Not counting the TV9. Pull the build records for all 7. It took them the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening. Victoria ordered food at some point. Sandwiches from a place on the corner, eaten at the edges of the table around the documentation. Nobody was particularly interested in the food. Mason ate half of his without seeming to notice he was doing it. Patterson drank coffee until his hands were visibly unsteady and then switched to water. Victoria ate standing up, which was something she did when she was in the middle of something and didn't want to fully commit to stopping. By 8 o'clock, they had a complete picture, and it was worse than Mason had estimated when he'd described a pattern to Victoria at Henderson's diner. Of the 7 active fleet vehicles built under Damien Cross's direct oversight, 4 showed structural deviations in load-bearing components. 2 of those 4 were scheduled to race in 6 days. One of them, the endurance car Patterson had flagged earlier, showed deviations in 3 separate structural systems, any one of which could produce a failure at racing speed. Mason was looking at the endurance car's build record when he said quietly, "This one's the worst. If this car goes out in current condition and runs a full race distance, the failure won't be at a test track with a slowdown zone. It'll be on a live circuit." Victoria set down what she was holding. How bad? He thought about how to say it without being dramatic, because he didn't have a flair for drama, but also without softening it in a way that let it be misunderstood. Bad enough that I wouldn't let anyone I cared about within 200 feet of it at speed. That was clear enough. Those 2 cars get grounded tonight, Victoria said. She looked at Patterson. I need you to process the hold order through official channels, and I need you to do it in a way that gives no indication of why. Mechanical review. Unspecified. Nothing connecting it to Cross or the documentation work we've been doing. Why? Patterson asked. Because if Cross knows we're looking at his change orders before we have the full record secured, we may not have the full record to look at for very long, Victoria said. Can you do that? Patterson nodded, but he didn't look entirely comfortable with it. He was a straightforward engineer not naturally suited to the strategic dimension of what she was describing. I can. Good. She turned to Mason. I need to know how you want to handle this. He looked at her. What do you mean? You came back here to protect the drivers. That's done. Or it will be done tonight when those cars are grounded. You don't owe this company anything beyond that. If you want to give me the documentation and walk away and let me deal with Cross, no, he said, simply, without pause. Mason. The full picture isn't secured yet, he said. You've got change orders, but change orders can be explained. What you need is the original specifications compared against the build reality, and you need someone who can speak to what those deviations actually mean, not in general terms, but specifically, in technical language that can't be argued around. He looked at her steadily. I'm the only person in this building who can do that. Victoria held his gaze. I know that. I'm not doing it for the company, he said. I want to be clear about that. Then what are you doing it for? He thought about Ramirez's shaking hands after the car had come apart at turn 4. He thought about the endurance car's build record and the 3 separate structural systems that were currently compromised, and the driver whose name was listed on the entry form for next week's race. A name he didn't know, but that belonged to a person the same way Ramirez was a person, the same way anyone was a person. There are people whose safety depends on this being done right, he said. That's enough of a reason. Victoria nodded. She didn't say anything for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter than it had been. Then we do it right. The problem with doing it right was that doing it right required getting close to Damien Cross without Damien Cross understanding how close. Cross had been at this for years. He was not stupid, and he was not careless, and the fact that his paper trail had survived 11 years of institutional operation without being examined meant he understood perfectly well how institutional operations worked and where the blind spots were. The change orders were problematic for him, but they were explainable. Supply chain constraints, engineering judgment, cost optimization. He had a story for each of them. What he could not explain was the source of the original designs he'd been presenting as Titan Velocity's ongoing engineering development, because those designs, when you looked at them carefully, were built on the same fundamental methodology as the work Mason had produced before he'd left. Not copies, exactly. Elaborations. The way a student elaborates on a teacher's framework without ever acknowledging the teacher. That was the evidence that mattered. And that evidence lived partly in the physical archive and partly in the digital system, and Damian Cross had access to both. Victoria called the company's head of security on Thursday morning. His name was Gerald Huang, a retired federal investigator who'd been with Titan Velocity for 3 years and who had the specific quality of being very calm about situations that weren't calm. She explained what she needed in broad strokes without naming the target of the concern. "I need the archive access logs from the past 2 weeks," she said, "physical and digital, and I need the engineering file server's audit trail for the same period." Gerald didn't ask why. He said, "Give me 2 hours." He was back in 90 minutes. The physical archive access log showed that Damian Cross had entered the archive on Tuesday evening, the same evening Victoria had been down there pulling championship-era documentation. The timestamp was 11:40 p.m., 2 hours after Victoria had left. The digital audit trail showed that on Wednesday morning, between 6 a.m. and 7:30 a.m., 14 engineering files in the company's internal server had been accessed from Cross's credentials. 7 of those files were in the TV9 development folder. 4 were in the folders for the vehicles Mason had flagged. The files themselves hadn't been deleted, but the version histories had been altered, compressed. Earlier revision states that would have shown the original specifications more clearly had been collapsed into summary versions that were harder to distinguish from the current build documentation. Gerald laid this out on Victoria's desk without commentary. "He knew," she said. "Someone knew," Gerald said carefully. "I'd want to be thorough before attaching a name to that." "Whose credentials were used?" Gerald looked at her. "Cross's." "Then we're being thorough about the right person," Victoria said. "What do we need to preserve this before it goes any further?" "Server-side snapshot of the current state, taken before any additional access. Physical archive goes under restricted access immediately." He paused. "And if you're thinking about what I think you're thinking about, you should probably involve legal counsel before the next step." "I already called them this morning," Victoria said. "They're sending someone at 2 o'clock. Gerald almost smiled. "You were ahead of me." "I've been ahead of you since Tuesday," she said, and she wasn't being unkind about it. Mason didn't come to the campus on Thursday. He had told Victoria, when they'd finished the night before, that he needed to be home Wednesday night, and Thursday was his daughter's school thing. She'd said it that way herself, your daughter's school thing, which she'd noted because she didn't know the specifics, but she understood that it was non-negotiable. And she respected non-negotiable. He was in the school gymnasium by 6:30 Thursday evening, sitting in the 3rd row of folding chairs with 150 other parents and guardians, watching his daughter's class present their art projects. Lily had made, in the end, after considerable deliberation, a horse. She'd decided against the fast car interpretation on the grounds that the horse had 4 legs and a tail, and cars didn't have tails, which was more internally consistent logic than a lot of adults managed. She stood next to her horse drawing, which had been mounted on a board, and explained to anyone within earshot that the horse was running because horses liked running, same as race cars, and that she'd made the mane orange because orange was faster looking than other colors. Mason sat in his folding chair with his arms on his knees and watched her explain this, and the thing he felt was not complicated and not mixed with anything else. It was just what it was. Afterward, she wanted to stop at the diner. Not Henderson's, a different one closer to the school, a place they went sometimes on school event nights because it had milkshakes, and Lily had decided years ago that milkshakes were the appropriate conclusion to formal public occasions. They sat across from each other in the booth. Lily had chocolate. Mason had coffee. Mrs. Petrova said my horse was expressive, Lily said. What does expressive mean? Lily considered this. I think it means it looked like it had feelings. Does your horse have feelings? Obviously. Look at it. She held up the drawing, which she'd carried out of the gymnasium, rolled up under her arm. You can tell it's happy. Mason looked at the drawing. The horse had an orange mane, and what might generously be interpreted as a smile, or might be an artifact of the crayon having slipped. Yeah, he said. I can tell. Lily put the drawing down and went back to her milkshake. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that sometimes settled over her without warning, and Mason knew from experience that this quiet usually preceded something. Dad, she said. Yeah. Are you working somewhere different now? He looked at her across the table. 7 years old, watching him with her mother's eyes, asking the question sideways the way kids ask things when they already suspected the answer and weren't sure how to handle it. I'm helping some people with something, he said. It's temporary. She processed this. Is it the fixing kind of helping or a different kind? The fixing kind, he said. A big thing that needs fixing. Lily seemed to find this acceptable. She went back to her milkshake and didn't ask anything further, and Mason sat across from her with his coffee and thought about the endurance car and the 6 remaining days before a driver he didn't know would climb into it and trust, without knowing there was any reason not to, that the people responsible for that machine had done their jobs. He thought about that, and then he made himself stop thinking about it, because Lily was here, and the milkshake was half gone, and she was going to have a question about the orange mane in about 30 seconds, and he wanted to be present for it. He was right. She had the question in 20. Friday morning, Damien Cross walked into Victoria Sterling's office without knocking. This was not unusual behavior for him. He had been doing it for years, not with Victoria, who was new, but with her father before her, and the habit had transferred without modification. It was a small power gesture dressed up as casual familiarity, and Victoria had noticed it from the first week and filed it without acting on it. Today she let him come in because she'd been expecting him. I heard you pulled hold orders on the 7C and the endurance car, he said. He had a coffee cup in his hand and the relaxed posture of a man who is performing relaxation. Mechanical review. Can I ask what triggered that? Post-incident protocol, Victoria said, after the TV9. The TV9 was a specific structural failure. It doesn't necessarily imply. It implies that I want to be thorough, she said. Is there a reason the hold concerns you? A small pause. It concerns me from a scheduling standpoint. We have a race commitment in 6 days. I understand that. Victoria, those cars have been through inspection. If there's a specific technical concern, I'm the right person to lead the review. That's my division. I know it is, she said. I'll keep you informed. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he smiled. Not a real smile, the kind that's a reflex rather than a feeling, and said, Of course, and left. Victoria watched the door close behind him. She had a legal pad on her desk, and she wrote one word on it, underlined it twice, and set the pen down. Careful. Not a note about Cross. A note to herself. Because the thing about a man who had been careful for 11 years was that he was very good at it. And very good at it meant he would know, faster than she wanted him to, that the walls were moving. And a man like that, feeling walls move, would not sit still. She called Gerald Huang. I need a flag on any access attempts to the archive or the engineering server outside of business hours. Tonight, this weekend, anytime. I want to know the second it happens. Already set it up, Gerald said. Since yesterday. Good. She paused. Thank you, Gerald. That's twice you've thanked me this week, he said. I'm keeping count. She almost smiled. Don't get used to it. Done. Mason came back to the campus Saturday morning. Victoria had arranged for him to have access to a workspace in the original building, not in the main engineering wing, where Cross's people worked, but in a smaller room off the archive that had been used for document review and had a table, decent lighting, and no windows to the main corridor. He'd asked specifically for no windows to the main corridor, and she hadn't pressed him on why. They worked through Saturday with Patterson, building a complete technical comparison between Mason's original design specifications and the actual build documentation for all 7 flagged vehicles. Mason was methodical in the way that good engineers are methodical, not slow, but thorough in a way that left no gaps, because gaps were the places where someone could later insert a different explanation. By Saturday afternoon, they had something that wasn't just suggestive, it was definitive. A side-by-side technical record showing exactly where each deviation occurred, what it changed structurally, what the engineering consequence of that change was, and the specific financial savings it represented in manufacturing cost. That last column, the financial savings, was the part that told the clearest story, because when you added them up across all 7 cars and then across the longer history of Cross's change order authority, the cumulative number was significant. Not enormous by corporate standards, but significant for an engineering division that operated on defined budget lines. And that money had to have gone somewhere. Who has access to the engineering division's budget allocations? Mason asked. Cross controls his division's budget, Victoria said. Does he submit to finance directly or through an intermediary? He submits to finance directly. He has a separate reporting line for budget matters. Mason looked at her. He didn't say anything, but the question in the look was clear enough. I know, Victoria said quietly. I know. She called her legal counsel Saturday evening from the parking lot, sitting in her car in the cold because she didn't want to have the conversation inside. The lawyer, a woman named Andrea Solis, sharp and unhurried in the way that good lawyers are unhurried, listened to the summary without interrupting. When Victoria finished, Andrea said, "You have enough for an internal investigation with legal standing. The budget allocation question you're describing could potentially reach criminal threshold depending on what the financial records show, but that's a different process." Can we get the financial records? You're the owner, you can order an internal audit, but once you do that, if Cross is alerted, he'll know it's over, Victoria said. He may attempt to exit and take documentation with him, Andrea said. Or he may do nothing, because he's been this careful for this long, and he believes he can still walk through it. Smart, careful people sometimes freeze when they see the trap close because they've never had to exist in a world where they got caught. Victoria looked out through her windshield at the dark parking lot. The campus lights were on their evening settings, and the building ahead of her looked still and ordinary from out here. Then we move fast, Victoria said. I want the audit order processed first thing Monday morning before he gets here, and I need you on site. I'll be there at 7:30, Andrea said. Victoria ended the call. She sat in the car for a moment. She thought about the archive room and the boxes of documents she'd spread across the folding table on Tuesday evening, and the handwriting she'd found on those design sheets, the compressed, precise letters, the careful professional notations of a man who'd put an entire company's engineering foundation down on paper and then disappeared from the record, while the record itself stayed. There were things she could not undo. The toolbox on the floor was one of them. The 30 people who had watched it was another. You could apologize for those things and mean it, and still not be able to take them back, and she knew that, and she was going to have to sit with it. What she could do was the thing in front of her. She was very good at doing the thing in front of her. She started the car and drove back toward the building. There was more work to do tonight, and the weekend wasn't over, and Damian Cross was in the building because his keycard had been flagged at the front entrance 40 minutes ago. Gerald had texted her, and whatever he was doing in there on a Saturday evening, she wanted to be there too. She wasn't afraid of him. She didn't think he was the kind of man you needed to be afraid of. Not physically. He was the kind of man who operated in paperwork and process and the invisible authority of institutional position. In those terms, he was formidable and had been for 11 years. But those were also exactly the terms on which he was about to lose. She pulled back into the parking lot and got out of her car and walked into the building through the main entrance. And the lobby guard, who knew her, said, "Good evening," and she set it back and went up to the second floor. Mason was still in the document review room. The light under the door was on. She knocked twice and went in, and he was at the table with his reading glasses on. She hadn't seen him wear them before, going through one last set of build records, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. a legal pad filled with notations beside the binder. He looked up when she came in. "Cross is in the building," she said. Mason took his glasses off. He set them on the table. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite calm. It was something more complicated than calm, the face of a person processing information they've been waiting for and aren't sure what to do with now that it's here. "Okay," he said. "Gerald has eyes on him. He went to his office. He's at his computer." "The server access flag. Gerald's watching it." Mason nodded. He put his glasses back on and turned back to the build records. "Then let him do what he's going to do," he said. "We've already got what we need. If he touches anything now, it just adds to the record." Victoria looked at him for a moment. This man in his flannel shirt with his reading glasses and his cold coffee and his legal pad full of handwriting that looked exactly like the handwriting she'd found in the archive, precise and compressed and completely certain of itself. "You've been doing this for 3 days," she said. "Are you okay?" He seemed briefly surprised by the question, not offended, just surprised, like it wasn't one he'd been expecting. "Yeah," he said. He paused. "My daughter thinks I'm fixing a big thing. She's right. I'd like to finish fixing it." "You will," Victoria said. He looked at her over his reading glasses. "We will," he said, with the particular mild emphasis of someone correcting something that matters to them, and went back to work. Gerald Huang's text came through at 9:47 p.m. on Saturday night. He accessed the engineering server, TV9 folder, and 3 others. Attempted to delete revision histories. Server snapshot blocked the deletion. Files are preserved. He knows the snapshot is there now. He stopped. Victoria read it standing in the hallway outside the document review room. She read it twice, then went back in and handed her phone to Mason without a word. He read it, set the phone on the table, took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "He knows," Mason said. "Yes." "Then Monday morning is too late." She had already come to that conclusion in the hallway. "I'm calling Andrea." She stepped back out and dialed. Andrea Solis picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call, or close to it. "He moved tonight," Victoria said. "Attempted deletion, blocked by the snapshot. Gerald has the access log." "Is he still in the building?" Victoria looked at her phone screen, switched to the text thread with Gerald. "Gerald, is Cross still on site?" She waited. The reply came in 40 seconds. "Yes, still in his office." "Don't let him leave with anything," Andrea said. Her voice had gone from unhurried to precise. "Not a hard drive, not a folder, not a phone he didn't come in with. Can Gerald manage that?" "I'll ask him." "I'm calling the firm's investigative team. They can be there in 90 minutes. A pause. "Victoria, this is the moment where it either holds together or it doesn't. Everything you've built this week needs to be in a format I can work with by the time my team arrives." "It will be," Victoria said. She went back into the room. Mason was already on his feet, reorganizing the document stacks in the order they'd need to be presented. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because that was how he handled the space between a decision and its consequences. He moved things into order. It was just how he was built. "Patterson," Victoria said. "I texted him," Mason said. "He's coming in." She looked at him. "You texted Patterson. You were on the phone." He said it simply without any particular flavor. "We need 3 copies of everything. The technical comparison, the change order file, the original spec documentation, 2 physical, 1 digital. Gerald's team can handle the copies." "I'll feel better if I do it myself," he said. She understood that. Some things you needed to do with your own hands because you needed to know for certain they were done right. She didn't argue with it. Patterson arrived at 10:30, hair uncombed, jacket over what appeared to be pajama pants, looking like a man who had answered a text message without fully registering its implications and then registered them in the car. He stood in the doorway of the document review room, took in the scene, Mason and Victoria and the organized stacks of documentation and the general atmosphere of something that had moved past the point of being stoppable, and said, "Okay, what do I do?" "Copies," Mason said. "Start with the technical comparison." Patterson sat down and got to work. Andrea Solis arrived at 11:20 with two members of her investigative team and a forensic IT specialist who went directly to Gerald Huang without stopping to introduce herself to anyone. By midnight, the second floor of the original building was the quietest version of controlled chaos. People moving between rooms with purpose, voices low, the kind of institutional machinery that only activates in genuine emergencies, and that most people who work in companies never see operating at full capacity. Damian Cross was still in his office upstairs. Victoria knew this because Gerald had positioned someone in the corridor, and because Cross hadn't tried to leave, which Andrea had said could mean several things, but probably meant he hadn't yet decided what his best move was. That period of indecision was the window they needed. At 12:40 a.m., Andrea knocked on Victoria's temporary office door and came in. She had a yellow legal pad with notes on it and the expression of someone who had reviewed the material and reached a conclusion. "What you have is sufficient," Andrea said. "The technical comparison Mason produced is, frankly, it's exceptional. The specificity of the deviation analysis, the documentation of the structural consequences, the financial pattern across the budget records. This is a clearer picture than most internal investigations produce in 3 weeks, and you did it in 3 days." "Mason did most of it," Victoria said. "Mason did the technical architecture of it. You held the institutional pieces together." Andrea paused. "I want to be clear with you about what happens Monday. We present Cross with the full documentation in a formal meeting. His options at that point are limited. He can try to contest the technical findings, but he'd need an expert who can counter Mason Ryder's analysis, and that is a very short list of people." "He won't find one," Victoria said. "No," Andrea agreed. "He won't." She looked at her notes. The financial records show approximately $430,000 in unexplained budget variance over 9 years. That number, combined with the documented change order pattern, creates a reasonable basis for referral to external authorities. Victoria let that land for a moment. $430,000. Not a number that destroyed companies. A number that destroyed people. Specifically the kind of person who had decided that their position entitled them to something they hadn't earned, gradually, incrementally, over 9 years, in amounts small enough to stay beneath the surface. "He had a family," Victoria said, not entirely sure why she said it. Andrea looked at her. "People with families make these choices too." "I know." Victoria rubbed her eyes. She hadn't slept properly since Tuesday, and it was now approaching 1 in the morning. "I know they do. I'm not excusing it. I'm just—" She stopped. "Human," Andrea said. "Something like that." My neck. Sunday passed quietly, which was deceptive, the way quiet days before difficult ones tend to be deceptive. Victoria spent most of it at home doing the work Andrea had asked her to do, preparing the formal presentation for Monday's meeting, reviewing the language of the documentation hold, going through the company's official public record to understand exactly what would need to be corrected and in what order. Mason spent Sunday at home with Lily. He had promised her they would make something. She'd had a specific project in mind for 2 weeks, a birdhouse she'd seen in a book that she wanted to build for the backyard, and they'd been postponing it for various reasons. And she had indicated, with the particular firmness that 7-year-olds deploy when they've been patient long enough, that Sunday was the day. So Mason drove to the hardware store at 9 in the morning and bought cedar planks and appropriate fasteners and a small drill bit set because Lily had informed him she wanted to do the drilling herself, which required supervision, instruction, and a willingness to accept that the birdhouse was not going to be perfectly symmetrical. It was not perfectly symmetrical. One side was 8 millimeters shorter than the other because Lily had held the plank slightly off angle when Mason cut it, and neither of them had caught it until the cut was done. Lily examined the discrepancy for a moment and declared it fine because birds didn't care about symmetry, which Mason could not actually dispute. They worked on it through the morning. Lily was serious about the drilling. She held the drill with both hands, tongue slightly out, and applied the right amount of pressure the second time after the first time had gone too fast and skipped the mark. Mason held the wood steady and didn't interfere, which cost him some effort. He had opinions about the drilling angle that he kept to himself. By noon, it was done. Not beautiful. Cedar, hand-assembled, slightly asymmetrical, with a hole that was approximately where it should be, and an interior dimension that Mason was not entirely certain met the specifications for the species of bird Lily had decided she wanted to attract, which was bluebirds, because she'd seen one once in the school garden and decided they were the best birds. "Do you know what bluebirds eat?" Mason asked. "Bugs?" Lily said confidently. "Right. So you can't put seed in there for them." Lily thought about this. "We can put bugs in there. We are not putting bugs in there." "Dad, hospitality." Mason looked at his daughter. She was holding the birdhouse under one arm like it was something she'd made for the museum and was prepared to explain it to anyone who asked. Her hair had sawdust in it. She had a small cut on her left thumb from where the wood had caught the edge earlier, cleaned and bandaged, and declared unimportant. "Bluebirds eat the bugs that are already there naturally," he said. "You put the house up, they find it. The bugs are already in the yard. You don't have to stock it." Lily considered this. "That's a good system." "It's a very good system," Mason said. They went inside and had lunch, and Lily drew a picture of the birdhouse to document it. And Mason did the dishes and thought about Monday, and then stopped thinking about Monday because it would come regardless of whether he thought about it. At some point in the afternoon, while Lily was occupied with a book, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a while. He did that sometimes, just looked at them the way you look at something when you're trying to understand all the things it's been involved in. Hands that had drafted blueprints for championship race cars and held a toolbox while it got thrown across a garage floor and cleaned a drain channel and found a fractured weld and built a birdhouse with an asymmetrical side for a 7-year-old who thought birds deserved hospitality. He'd spent 5 years trying to be invisible. He wasn't entirely sure he'd known why until now. It wasn't grief exactly, or not only grief. It was something underneath the grief, the particular exhaustion of a person who had been responsible for things that mattered, and had then been in a position where none of that responsibility could protect the thing that mattered most. His wife had gotten sick and gotten worse, and he'd fixed everything he could think of to fix, and it hadn't changed anything. And when she was gone, the idea of going back to being the person who was brilliant at things felt like a bad joke. Not worth the effort, not worth the exposure. He'd needed to be anonymous for a while. He understood that now. The maintenance work, the quiet life, the deliberate invisibility. It wasn't running away, not exactly. It was a man putting himself somewhere safe while he figured out how to be himself again in a world that had a lily-shaped obligation in it and a specific empty place on his wife's side of the bed. He didn't know when he'd started feeling ready again. Maybe it was being in those garages. Maybe it was finding the fracture in the TV9's weld and knowing immediately what he was looking at. Maybe it was some animal part of him that recognized its own territory and responded to it before his conscious mind caught up. Maybe it didn't matter when. It was happening. That was enough. Monday morning arrived with the specific gray light of late October, the kind that didn't commit to being either overcast or clear and just settled into an ambient flatness that made everything look slightly more serious than it might otherwise. Victoria was at the company by 7. Andrea Solis arrived at 7:30 as promised, with her team and 3 copies of everything in a case that locked with a key. Mason came at 8, through the side entrance in a collared shirt and clean jeans. The same kind of clothes he always wore, just newer looking, which was the only external concession he made to the significance of the day. He walked through the door and Danny Ortega was in the corridor. The 2 men looked at each other. "I heard things," Danny said, "about what's been happening this week." "Yeah," Mason said, "and about who you are." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I was wondering when that would travel." Danny's expression was difficult to describe. It had several layers moving through it. Old guilt. And something like relief. And the specific complexity of a person who had watched a wrong thing happen and hadn't stopped it and had been carrying that. "I knew something was off that day, when you flagged the car. I should have pushed harder." "You gave me the time I needed to say what I needed to say," Mason said. "That's not nothing." "It wasn't enough." "No," Mason agreed, "but it wasn't nothing." He paused. "Are you okay with what's happening today?" Danny understood what he was asking, not about the logistics, but about the personal reality of it. Cross had been Danny's superior for years. This was going to be disruptive in the way that only things affecting real people's actual working days were disruptive. Yeah, Danny said, I'm okay with it. He paused. Go fix the big thing. Mason almost smiled. He walked down the corridor toward the second floor. The meeting with Damian Cross was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main conference room. This was Victoria's choice. Not a private office. Not a small room. The main conference room with its long table and glass walls, visible from the corridor. She had reasons for that. Some of them were practical and some of them were less practical, and she understood the difference. Cross arrived at 8:57, which told her he had prepared himself overnight. He was in a suit. He usually wore business casual in the office. And he had a leather portfolio under his arm, which meant he had brought his own documents, which meant he had decided on a strategy. Victoria was already seated at the head of the table. Andrea Solis was to her right. Patterson was to her left, looking like he would rather be anywhere else but doing his job competently regardless. Mason was at the far end of the table. Cross saw Mason when he walked in. His expression didn't change dramatically. It was a micro shift, the eyes going very still for just a second, the kind of stillness that isn't calm but is what happens when a person's internal system processes something significant and shuts down the surface while it does it. He sat down. He put his portfolio on the table. He looked at Victoria. This feels formal, he said. It is formal, Victoria said. She introduced Andrea. She explained in language that was calm and factual and utterly without the kind of rhetorical softening that invites negotiation, what the past week had produced. She went through it methodically. The archive discovery, the pattern of deviations, the change order documentation, the server access log from Saturday night, the financial audit variants. She put documents in front of him as she referenced them. One by one, Cross listened. He sat very still, which was an answer in itself. When she finished, he said, You're characterizing normal engineering adjustments as something they're not. Change orders are part of the build process. Any executive in my position makes those calls. Mason, Victoria said. Mason spoke for the first time since the meeting had started. The weld specification on the TV9 lateral mount was set at 12mm dual pass based on a specific torsional load calculation for the vehicle's intended race conditions. The change order reduced it to 9mm single pass. The load calculation didn't change. The race conditions didn't change. The only thing that changed was the cost of the materials and the time required to produce the weld. He looked at Cross directly. That's not a field judgment call. That's a structural compromise. Cross looked at him. And you are? Mason Ryder, Mason said. I designed the original specification. Something moved across Cross's face. It was brief and complicated and gone quickly. You've been gone for 5 years. The specifications didn't go anywhere, Mason said. They were in the archive the whole time. I'm going to need a moment with my own counsel, Cross said. Of course, Victoria said. She didn't move. There's one more thing I want to say before you make any calls. She waited until he looked at her. In 9 years, across 7 vehicles, the deviations in your change orders saved the engineering division approximately $430,000 against budget. The financial audit is determining where that variance went. I want you to understand that we have the full picture before you decide how you'd like to proceed. The leather portfolio stayed closed. Cross hadn't opened it once. He called his lawyer. He took 40 minutes. When he came back to the conference room, his posture had changed. Not collapsed exactly, but the architecture of his confidence had shifted in a way that was visible. He sat down. He looked at the table. What do you want? He said. The truth on the record, Victoria said. Complete documentation of every unauthorized modification, full cooperation with the financial audit. Your resignation, effective today, with a letter stating that the resignation is voluntary. She paused. Whether external authorities are involved is not something I can control after this meeting. That's Andrea's domain. Cross looked at Andrea. Andrea looked back at him with an expression that offered him nothing. If I cooperate fully, he started. That's a conversation for you and your lawyer, Andrea said, not for this room. It took another hour. His lawyer came to the building. There were conversations in separate rooms, the kind of institutional legal choreography that moves through its stages with specific language and specific document formats and is boring to watch and consequential in its outcomes. Victoria stayed for the part she needed to stay for and let Andrea handle the rest. At 11:15 a.m., Damien Cross signed a resignation letter. He signed a cooperation agreement with the company's legal counsel. He left the building through the back entrance with a cardboard box of personal items his assistant had packed at 11:42. 3 people saw him leave. None of them were from his team. The rest of Monday was administrative in a way that felt strange after everything that had preceded it. Hold orders processed, engineering records formally restored, a company-wide communication going out from Victoria's office, drafted and revised 4 times before it said what it needed to say without saying more than it needed to say. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Victoria called an all-hands meeting of the engineering division. This was not something she'd planned. She'd planned a more contained set of communications, filtered through department heads, measured in the way that institutional communications are measured when they're trying to minimize disruption. She drafted the communications and then sat with them for a few minutes and then sent them to her drafts folder and called the meeting instead. The engineering division gathered in the main floor of Bay 1, the same bay where, 11 days ago, a toolbox had been thrown across the floor and a maintenance worker in gray work clothes had been escorted out. Victoria stood in the front of the room and looked at the people in it, and they looked back at her. Mason was in the room. He was near the back wall, standing beside Danny Ortega, in his collared shirt and clean jeans, not obviously different from anyone else, except that he was the person several dozen people were trying not to stare at too obviously, because the story had moved through the building the way stories move through buildings, which is to say, completely. Victoria didn't use notes. "I want to talk about what happened in this building 11 days ago," she said, "and I want to be direct about it, because indirect doesn't serve anyone." The room was very quiet. "I made an assumption when I walked into this garage 11 days ago. I looked at a person who was trying to protect one of our drivers, and I categorized him based on the clothes he was wearing and the job title in his file, and I didn't ask a single question before I decided he didn't know what he was talking about." She paused. "I was wrong. I was wrong about who he was. I was wrong about what he knew, and I was wrong about how I handled it. What I did in this room was not acceptable, and I want every person standing here to know that I understand that." No one moved. "I want to tell you something else," she said. "The engineering foundation that this company has built its reputation on, the championship platforms, the prototype records, the structural architecture that every car we've built in the past decade has been grounded in, that work was done by one person. He built it before most of you were here, and when he left, his name was removed from the record." She looked at the room. "His name was Mason Ryder. He was standing in this garage 11 days ago, and none of us knew it, and I am ashamed of the way he was treated on that day." She didn't look at Mason directly when she said it. She'd made a deliberate decision about that. This wasn't a moment where the gesture should point at him. It should point at the room, at the company, at the collective record of what had been done and what needed to be different. "His name goes back on every piece of work he produced," she continued, "every blueprint, every design record, every historical document in the company archive. That happens this week. Not eventually. This week." She took a breath. "And the engineering division is going to be rebuilt, its processes, its oversight structure, its accountability systems, in a way that makes what Damien Cross was able to do for 9 years impossible. That work starts today." She stopped there. She didn't add anything else, because she'd said what needed to be said, and adding to it would dilute it. The room was still quiet. Then Patterson, from somewhere in the middle of the group, started clapping. Not enthusiastically. He wasn't an enthusiastic clapping kind of person, but deliberately. One person, then 2, then the whole room, and it wasn't a triumphant sound. It was something more complicated and more genuine than triumph. Mason, in the back, did not clap. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his expression was the expression of a person absorbing something large and not entirely sure what to do with it, which was at least honest. Afterward, when the room had emptied out, and it was just the 2 of them and Danny, who was pretending to check something on a clipboard near the door, Victoria walked over to Mason. You okay? She said. He thought about it for a moment. Ask me in a week. Fair enough, she paused. I mean what I said. All of it. I know you do, he said. And then, after a moment, it was a good speech. Coming from him, that meant something. She could tell he knew she knew that. I have to pick up Lily at 3:15, he said. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:07. Mason, I called the school. They have aftercare. She's fine. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying lightly all day and can finally put down. But I need to go. Go, she said. He went. The birdhouse went up in the backyard that evening. Lily supervised the installation with the serious attention she gave to things she'd made herself, directing the placement of the mounting post and the angle, and whether it was level, which it was, because Mason had a level in his truck and she'd asked him to use it. Perfect, she declared, stepping back. The asymmetrical side was facing west. In the last of the afternoon light, it looked like exactly what it was. Something made by hand, imperfectly, with care. Do you think a bluebird will find it? Lily asked. Mason looked at the birdhouse. He thought about the fractured weld in the archive room and the conference table and the sound of the room clapping and the weight of 11 years sitting differently on him tonight than it had this morning. Yeah, he said. I think one will. Lily seemed satisfied. She slipped her hand into his the way she did without thinking about it. A reflex, a habit, the physical shorthand of the particular trust that lives between a child and the parent who's been there every day. And they stood in the backyard together in the fading October light, looking at the thing they'd built. The birdhouse was crooked. The weld on his career was repaired. The record of his work was being restored, page by page, in the archive he'd walked away from 5 years ago. The company he'd built the foundation of was going to be something different now. Not better in a simple way, because nothing was ever better in a simple way, but changed in the specific direction of more honest, which was the only direction that actually lasted. None of that was what he was thinking about. He was thinking about whether bluebirds returned to the same house year after year, because if they did, that meant the house needed to be well built enough to last, and he was now reconsidering whether cedar was the right choice for their climate, and whether the roof angle was sufficient for water drainage. Dad, Lily said. Yeah. You're thinking about the birdhouse wrong. He looked down at her. What do you mean? You're thinking about whether it's good enough, she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has lived with a person long enough to read their silences. It's good enough. We made it. Mason looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. We did. The bluebird showed up on a Thursday. Lily saw it first, through the kitchen window, before school. She came running down the hallway in her socks and nearly took out the door frame and grabbed Mason's sleeve without saying anything, just pulled him toward the window and pointed. It was sitting on the roof of the birdhouse, small, with that particular shade of blue that doesn't look real until you're looking at it, just sitting there in the early morning light like it had been there before and knew the address. Dad, Lily whispered, with the specific reverence kids apply to things they were right about. Yeah, Mason said. I told you. You told me. She watched it for another minute, completely still, which was not a state Lily Ryder occupied with any frequency. Then it flew. Gone in the particular way birds go. Without announcement, without a clear moment of decision, just present and then not present. Lily turned away from the window. Okay, she said, fully returned to normal operational volume. I need my backpack. Mason watched the empty birdhouse for another second before going to find her backpack, which was where it always was, which was not where it was supposed to be, which was on the hook by the door. It was the second week of November. 3 weeks had passed since Cross had left the building with his cardboard box. 3 weeks since the all-hands meeting in Bay 1. 3 weeks since Mason had stood in the back of that room and not known what to do with his hands while the people around him clapped. In those 3 weeks, several things had happened, and several things had not happened, and the balance between those two categories was more honest than most endings tended to be. What had happened? The financial audit finished. The variance number came in at $462,000 across 9 years, slightly higher than Andrea's initial estimate. The money had been diverted through a series of vendor agreements with companies that, When examined carefully, shared ownership structures with entities connected to Cross personally. It was sophisticated enough to have survived routine review. It was not sophisticated enough to survive a forensic accountant with full access and a specific mandate. External authorities were involved. That process was slow and procedural in the way that legal processes are slow and procedural, and it would continue for months before it resolved into whatever it resolved into. Mason didn't follow it closely. Victoria gave him updates when there were updates worth giving, and otherwise neither of them spent much time on it. Cross was gone. The evidence was preserved. What happened from there was in the hands of people whose job it was to handle that particular category of outcome. What had also happened? Every engineering record in the Titan Velocity archive had been reviewed and reattributed. Every blueprint carrying Mason's work carried his name now. The process had taken a team of 2 people 11 days, cross-referencing against the design methodology documentation and the original sign-off records. When it was finished, Patterson had sent Mason a single email with a scanned image attached, the first championship platform blueprint, the one that had started everything, with his name on it in the margin notation field where it had always been until someone had removed it. Mason had looked at the image for a long time. He hadn't replied to the email right away. He'd come back to it that evening after Lily was in bed and written back 3 words. "Thank you, Patterson." Patterson had replied, "Thank you for building the thing we've been working on without knowing it. It was the kind of thing that was slightly too much, slightly overwrought, and Mason had read it and understood it and appreciated it anyway, because Patterson meant it, and meaning something counted." What had not happened yet? A formal answer to the question Victoria had been waiting to ask, and Mason had been waiting to be ready to hear. Bam Mam Cham. She asked it on a Tuesday in November, in the document review room that had become their unofficial working space over the past 3 weeks, because neither of them had gotten around to establishing a more appropriate location, and the room worked. She'd been using Mason as a consultant in the interim. No formal title, no official paperwork, just the 2 of them and Patterson working through the engineering division's restructuring plans, with the specificity that restructuring plans require when they're meant to actually change something, rather than just describe the intention to change something. Mason had been showing up 3 days a week. The other 2 days he worked from home, which was something she'd suggested and he'd agreed to without negotiating about it, which told her something. On this Tuesday, she put down the specification document she'd been reviewing and said, "I want to ask you something official." He looked up from his own documents. "Okay. I want you to come back as Chief Design Engineer." She said it plainly, the way she'd decided she was going to say it if she ever said it, without ornamentation. Full authority over the engineering division. You'd restructure it the way you think it should be structured. Hire who you think should be hired. Set the design standards going forward. Mason was quiet. "You don't have to answer today," she said. "I know." He put his pen down. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "What does the engineering division look like right now, structurally?" "Honestly." "Honestly? It's a team that's been operating under a system that rewarded certain behaviors for 9 years. Some of those people are good engineers who were working in a bad structure. Some of them learned the bad structure's habits. I can't always tell which is which from where I sit." "I can," he said. "I know you can." "That's not me being arrogant. I just..." He paused. "I spent 11 weeks in those garages as maintenance before any of this happened. I watched how the teams worked. I know who the good ones are." "Then you already have a draft of what the division needs to look like," Victoria said. "You've been running it in your head for 3 weeks. He didn't deny that. "There are things I'd need." "Tell me what they are." "I'm home by 6, he said. "Every day, non-negotiable. I don't care what's on the calendar." "Done." "If I have a technical disagreement with the decision you want to make, I need you to hear me out fully before the decision is made. Not necessarily to change your mind. Just hear the full argument." "That's how I want it to work too," she said. "I'm not looking for someone who'll tell me what I want to hear. I had that." He nodded. "I'll need to rebuild the inspection protocol from scratch. What we have now isn't adequate. I want independent sign-off requirements at every structural decision point, not just final inspection. Build it however you need to build it." He was quiet for another moment. Then, I need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was before. When I was here the first time, He stopped and started again. I was someone who was entirely inside the work. All the time. My wife used to say I could get lost in a blueprint for 6 hours and come out surprised it was dark. He looked at his hands on the table. I'm not that person anymore. I'm someone with a 7-year-old who needs dinner at 6:30 and help with multiplication and someone to sit next to her when she's scared of a thunderstorm. That's not going to change. Mason, Victoria said, that's not a condition I'm asking you to negotiate around. That's just who you are. He looked at her. And for what it's worth, she said, that's also why I want you running the engineering division. Because someone who understands that the work exists in service of a life and not the other way around is exactly the kind of person who builds things that don't cut corners to meet a deadline. It was probably the most she'd said in that direction at once, and she knew it, and she watched him sit with it. Okay, he said finally. Okay, yes? Okay, yes. She didn't make anything of it. She picked up her document and went back to what she'd been reading because that was the right thing to do. But there was something in the room that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier, something that wasn't dramatic but was real, which is the only kind of thing that lasts anyway. His first official day as chief design engineer was a Monday in late November. He drove to the campus in his truck, the same route he'd taken for 11 weeks as a maintenance technician. He parked in a different space, not the maintenance lot around the back, but the regular employee lot near the main entrance, which was a small logistical change that felt larger than it should have. He sat in the truck for a moment before going in. He thought about the day he'd walked out through the employee exit with his toolbox, and the text from Danny, and the drive home, and the pasta on the stove, and Lily asking about the bay leaves. He thought about all the distance between that day and this one. Not in time. 3 weeks was nothing. But in the particular distance that opens up when the shape of a thing changes. He got out of the truck. He got his toolbox from the back, the same Craftsman case with the latch that didn't sit quite flush, and carried it in with him. He'd thought about leaving it in the truck. He decided against it. It belonged in the building, same as he did. The lobby guard, a man named Carl, who had been there for years and who had, Mason suspected, noticed a great deal over those years without making much of any of it, looked up when Mason came through the door. "Morning," Carl said. "Morning," Mason said. "Nice to have you back proper," Carl said. Just that. He went back to his desk. Mason went up to the second floor. His office was the one that had been Cross's job. Victoria had offered it specifically, which was either a practical decision about space or a deliberate symbolic one, and he thought it might be both. He'd accepted it because the third-floor view of the test track was something he needed to be able to see from where he worked. He'd always thought better when he could see the track. There was something about the visible consequence of the work, the actual surface that the thing you built would eventually run on, that kept the decision-making honest. He put his toolbox under the desk. He sat in the chair for a moment. Then he pulled out a legal pad and started writing down everything he needed to do in the order it needed to be done. The first team meeting of the restructured engineering division happened that Friday. Mason had spent the week doing what he'd told Victoria he'd already been doing in his head, assessing the team, understanding who was who, mapping the division's actual capabilities against what it claimed to be capable of. He'd found what he expected to find. About a third of the team were genuinely strong engineers who had been operating in a system that hadn't asked enough of them. Another third were competent people who had learned to do less than they could because less had been rewarded. The final third were a mixed group that would take more time to understand. He stood at the front of the conference room on Friday afternoon and looked at the people who were now his team. He was not a man who gave speeches. He had never been comfortable in front of rooms, which was one of the small ironies of his career. A person whose work affected thousands of people, and who deeply disliked being looked at by more than 3 of them at once. He'd gotten competent at managing it. He'd never gotten comfortable. "I'm going to keep this short," he said. "I know you've heard a lot of things in the past few weeks about what this division is going to look like going forward. I'm not going to add to that today." The room was attentive in the specific way rooms are attentive when the new person in charge says something that doesn't match what they were expecting. "What I will tell you is what I care about," he continued. "I care about whether the work is right. Not whether it's on time, not whether it's on budget, not whether it makes the meeting look good. Whether it's right. Whether the specification is correct, whether the structure is sound, whether the thing we're building will do what we say it will do without hurting anyone. He paused. If you find a problem, I want to know about it. I don't care when you find it. I don't care how inconvenient it is. I don't care if it means delaying something. Tell me. That's the job. He stopped there. He looked at the room. Questions? A woman in the second row, one of the younger engineers, a structural specialist named Chen, who had been with the company 2 years and who Mason had assessed as genuinely sharp, raised her hand. Are we keeping Patterson as lead coordinator? Yes. Good, she said, and put her hand down. Something in the room relaxed fractionally. Anything else? Nothing. Okay, he said. Let's go to work. December came. The light changed, went lower and more slanted, and the campus in the mornings had a particular cold quiet to it that Mason had always liked about late autumn in Ohio. The way everything stripped down to what it actually was without the busyness of other seasons to obscure it. The engineering division was different already. Not transformed. That word implied a completeness that didn't exist, and Mason was suspicious of completeness anyway. But different. The inspection protocols were rebuilt and running, the structural sign-off requirements had been implemented, and Patterson had put together a tracking system that made every decision point visible at every stage. Chen had turned out to be exactly as good as Mason had thought she was, and he'd given her the suspension geometry project for the next platform development, which was the kind of assignment that told someone where they stood without requiring a conversation about it. The 2 grounded cars had been properly rebuilt. Not patched, rebuilt, with correct specifications and independent verification at every structural point. Mason had supervised that process personally, which meant he'd been in the garage on several days in a maintenance capacity that nobody commented on except Danny Ortega, who had come by on a Tuesday and found Mason under the endurance car with a flashlight and said, "Didn't I see you doing that for about 11 weeks in a row?" "Different car," Mason said, from under the car. "Same flashlight." "It's a good flashlight." Danny had left him alone after that. That was one of the things Mason liked about Danny, which was that he knew when a thing had been said and didn't need to be expanded on. The endurance car ran its first proper test in early December. Mason was at the track for it, not in a formal capacity, just standing at the barrier with a cup of coffee, watching. The driver, whose name he now knew was Garrett, because he'd made it his business to know the names of the people who got in the machines, ran 7 clean laps and came in shaking hands with the crew and looking the way drivers look after a test where everything works the way it's supposed to, which is a specific kind of satisfied that doesn't have a particularly good word for it. Garrett found Mason near the barrier afterward. Word had gotten around to the drivers, too, the way word got around. "You're Ryder," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. I heard you're the one who figured out the endurance car was compromised." "Patterson and I put the documentation together," Mason said. "It was a team thing." Garrett looked at him for a moment. He was 28, maybe 29, with the particular lean physicality of people who spent their professional lives fitting into small spaces and the direct eye contact that came from a profession where your judgment of situations had to be fast and accurate. "Well," Garrett said, "whatever it was. Thank you." He said it without ceremony, the way people say important things when they mean them straightforwardly and don't feel the need to dress them up. Mason nodded. Garrett went back to his crew. Mason finished his coffee.